2026 midterms are about a year and a half away. History suggests it should be a good cycle for Democrats, at least relative to the disaster that was 2024, where Republicans not only took back the White House, but also flipped the Senate, securing a 53-seat majority. Typically, the sitting president's party, in this case Donald Trump's Republicans, loses seats in Congress, especially in the midterm directly after taking office. However, once again, the Senate map structurally favors the GOP. Of the 33 seats up for election in November 2026, plus 2 special elections, 22 are held by Republicans and just 13 by Democrats. Yet it's the Democrats who face the toughest battles in competitive races. Their biggest challenge? Defending 2 seats in states Trump carried in 2024, Michigan and Georgia. Beyond that, 5 Democratic senators represent states Kamala Harris won by a single-digit margin: New Hampshire, Minnesota, Virginia, New Jersey, and New Mexico. On the Republican side, there's only one GOP-held seat in a state Harris carried, Susan Collins' seat in Maine. Meanwhile, North Carolina is the only Republican seat up for grabs in a state Trump won by a single-digit margin. As always, plenty of Senate seats are safely in one party's column, barring a major scandal or a dramatic political shift, unlike anything seen in the past 2 decades. If there's one thing we can say with certainty about American politics today, it's that the electoral map remains largely consistent from cycle to cycle, with both major parties running competitively in the race for a majority. For Democrats, there's little reason to worry about Oregon, where incumbent Jeff Merkley is seeking a 4th term. Merkley won his last 2 races by more than 15 points. I also expect John Hickenlooper to comfortably win re-election to a 2nd term in Colorado, which he has said will be his last in the Senate. Hickenlooper was first elected in 2018 after serving 2 terms as governor, and Colorado has trended much further to the left compared to the nation since then. Illinois is a bit more of a question mark. We don't yet know if Senate Whip Dick Durbin will seek a 6th term. If he does, Illinois would be a safe Democratic hold. Even if he doesn't, it would still be a long shot for Republicans to flip this seat in an unfavorable environment. While Illinois is definitely trending right, the pace of change isn't fast enough to flip the state in less than 2 years. Finally, in the Northeast, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware are all safe Democratic holds, with incumbents running for re-election. The only slight question mark is Ed Markey in Massachusetts, but even if he were to retire, it wouldn't change much. Massachusetts remains one of the 3 most Democratic states in the country. Republicans have a significantly higher number of safe states. The incumbents in these states are all expected to seek re-election, but even if some retire, the strong Republican partisan lean of each state should be more than enough to overcome even the most well-funded Democratic challenger. There's an outside chance that races in Alaska, Kansas, South Carolina, or Florida could become more competitive. However, with former Congresswoman Mary Peltola now expected to run for governor in Alaska instead of the Senate, incumbent Republican Dan Sullivan should have a clear path to re-election. Similarly, with Kansas's outgoing Democratic governor Laura Kelly making it clear she is absolutely not running for another office. Incumbent Republican Roger Marshall should cruise as well. In South Carolina, Lindsey Graham should also have a smoother path than he did in 2020 when he still won by 10 points despite facing Jamie Harrison, who raised more money than any U.S. Senate candidate in history. And in Florida, as long as newly appointed Senator Ashley Moody wins the Republican nomination, the GOP should have little trouble holding the seat. Moody has overperformed in both of her previous statewide races for Attorney General. That leaves just 13 states without a rating. As it stands, Republicans hold the initial advantage with 46 seats to the Democrats' 41. Each of the remaining races is either expected to be competitive or carries enough uncertainty that a safe rating would be premature at this stage. Let's start in New Mexico, one of 5 seats Democrats are defending in states Kamala Harris carried by single digits in 2024. Ironically, incumbent Democrat Ben Ray Lujan's relatively low profile might actually work to his advantage. An average Democrat should win this race by at least 5 points, and with no strong Republican challenger currently in the mix, this seat is very likely to remain in Democratic hands. And then there's Texas. Once again, the state teased Democrats before slapping them in the face this past November, with Trump carrying it by nearly 14 points. Texas saw the sixth largest Republican swing between 2020 and 2024, effectively squashing any chance Democrats had of unseating four-term incumbent Republican John Cornyn. That said, if Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton successfully mounts a primary challenge against Cornyn, the general election could become far more interesting. Paxton has been embroiled in multiple controversies, including an impeachment, which could make the race more competitive than expected. Up in Nebraska, the 2024 cycle's biggest surprise, incumbent Republican Pete Ricketts, is running for his first full term in the Senate. He's not particularly popular even among Republicans, and there's a chance that Dan Osborne could launch another independent campaign after coming within 7 points of unseating Deb Fischer last November. For now, though, this race remains in the likely Republican column. I did just realize I forgot to mention Montana when discussing the safe Republican seats. Incumbent Steve Daines should win easily, as a popular and relatively high-profile Republican within Senate leadership. You may remember the 2020 Senate race here, where Daines handily defeated former Montana Governor Steve Bullock, despite polls suggesting it was effectively a toss-up. This time around, there's little reason to believe he'll face a serious challenge. Over in Minnesota, Democrat Tina Smith has opted not to seek a second term, making this the first U.S. Senate race in the state without an incumbent since 2006, the same year Republicans last won a federal election here. While Democrats have a deep bench of potential candidates, Republicans don't have quite the same luxury. At this stage, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan appears to have the edge in the Democratic primary, with Congresswoman Angie Craig as the next most likely contender. On the Republican side, former NBA player Royce White is the biggest name to enter the race so far, but he just lost to Amy Klobuchar by 16 points in 2024. If Representatives Brad Finstad or Michelle Fischbach decide to run, the race could become more competitive. For now, though, Democrats have roughly an 80% chance of holding this seat, putting Minnesota in the likely Democratic column. And once again, I realize I forgot to mention another safe Republican seat. Iowa is effectively a lock for the GOP at this point, with incumbent Joni Ernst running for a third term. While both of her previous elections were decided by single digits, Iowa has continued to trend more Republican, and at least so far, Democrats don't seem to be taking this race seriously, with not even a single notable candidate floated at this point. Sticking in the Great Lakes region, let's head to Michigan, where two-term Democrat Gary Peters has also announced his retirement. This one poses a bigger challenge for Democrats, especially after losing the state in the 2024 presidential race. While Alyssa Slotkin managed to hold on to Debbie Stabenow's open seat in 2024, she did so by just 20,000 votes. Now, former Congressman Mike Rogers, who narrowly lost that race, is expected to announce his candidacy any day now. The big question for Democrats is whether Pete Buttigieg decides to run. Personally, I think he will. I actually made an entire video about it, which you can check out by clicking the link in the top right corner. Buttigieg quietly moved to Michigan after his surprise breakout in the 2020 Democratic presidential primaries, a strong indication that he's been positioning himself for a future run in the state. With Peters stepping aside, this is the perfect opportunity for him to get back onto the national stage. If Buttigieg enters the race, I'd expect him to win the primary easily and raise a massive amount of money along the way. Of course, it's impossible to predict how he'd perform relative to the fundamentals, but his fundraising potential, combined with the likelihood of a bluer national environment, gives Democrats an edge here. For now, I have Michigan in the tilt Democratic column. Down in Ohio, we're looking at a special election to fill the remainder of the Senate term vacated by Vice President J.D. Vance. Republican Governor Mike DeWine appointed Lieutenant Governor John Husted to replace Vance, and Husted is expected to run as an unelected incumbent in November 2026. On the Democratic side, former Congressman Tim Ryan has expressed interest in running. He previously lost to Vance in the 2022 Senate race. There's also speculation that newly ousted Senator Sherrod Brown could attempt a comeback after losing his fourth-term bid to Republican Bernie Moreno by about 3.5 points. According to the latest prediction market odds, Brown and Ryan each have about a 40% chance of securing the Democratic nomination. Given Ohio's strong Republican lean and Houston's status as a relatively moderate, mainstream Republican, the GOP holds the clear advantage regardless of the Democratic nominee. However, if Brown enters the race, it could inch closer to toss-up territory. Now let's head to Virginia. Incumbent Democrat Mark Warner will be heavily favored for re-election, with one key caveat: Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin. If Youngkin is persuaded to run, the race would shift firmly into lean Democratic territory. Without him, Warner would be in the likely to borderline safe range. Splitting the difference, I'm keeping it at likely Democratic for now. Moving down the Atlantic coastline, we come to the two highest profile races of the cycle, North Carolina and Georgia. There's a good chance that when we look back on 2026, these two contests will define which party came out on top. If Democrats can flip the North Carolina seat and hold Georgia, it will likely coincide with flipping the House, putting a halt to Trump's agenda and setting them up nicely for 2028. On the other hand, if Republicans hold North Carolina and flip Georgia, it would empower Trump further and mark yet another disappointing cycle for the Democrats. In North Carolina, Republican Thom Tillis is expected to seek a third term, though he may face a primary challenge. The state's Republican Party censured Tillis over his bipartisan support for gun control and same-sex marriage, and for a time, former RNC co-chair Laura Trump was floated as a potential challenger. However, she has officially ruled out a run, leaving Tillis without a serious opponent at this point. On the Democratic side, outgoing Governor Roy Cooper is widely expected to enter the race, which would be a best-case scenario for Democrats. Cooper maintained strong approval ratings throughout his two terms, has built-in name recognition, and comes with a well-established fundraising network. He's even led Tillis in both polls surveying this race so far, one by 4 points and the other by just 1. If it comes down to Tillis versus Cooper, expect an extremely close race. This one is a true 50-50 toss-up. In Georgia, incumbent Democrat Jon Ossoff is running for a second term. He was first narrowly elected in the high-profile Georgia runoffs back in 2021, unseating Republican incumbent David Perdue by about a point, after Perdue came just 0.3 of a percentage point from avoiding a runoff altogether in the November general election. Now in 2026, outgoing Republican Governor Brian Kemp, who is term-limited, is widely seen as the frontrunner for the GOP nomination. Kemp would be the strongest candidate Republicans could field for this race, and arguably the strongest non-incumbent in the entire country this cycle. That's why most analysts consider Ossoff the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent in 2026. That said, Georgia saw one of the smallest pro-Republican shifts in the country between the 2020 and 2024 presidential elections, similar to North Carolina. Both states are experiencing slow but steady demographic trends favoring Democrats, with rapidly growing and diversifying urban areas attracting large numbers of college-educated voters from liberal pockets in the West and Northeast. Still, Kemp's strength as a candidate likely outweighs Ossoff's incumbency advantage, leaving the fundamentals effectively even. This race is a toss-up, with the outcome heavily dependent on the national environment. Anything short of a strong Democratic wave would likely give Kemp the edge. In New Hampshire, incumbent Democrat Jeanne Shaheen is favored to hold the seat she's held since 2008. She was last re-elected in 2020 by 16 points against a weak opponent, but this time she may face a more familiar challenger, former U.S. Senator Scott Brown. Brown, who previously represented Massachusetts, ran against Shaheen in 2014 and lost by just 3 points. That said, I don't see Shaheen as being in any real danger. The 2014 race took place in a massive Republican wave year, and she still managed to win. The 2026 cycle, at worst, should be a neutral national environment, and more likely than not, one that favors Democrats. For now, New Hampshire is lean Democratic, and it's closer to likely than tilt. The more fascinating race in the Northeast is in Maine. Incumbent Republican Senator Susan Collins is a political unicorn. Back in 2020, despite nearly every poll and analyst predicting her defeat, Collins defied expectations and beat Democratic nominee Sarah Gideon by about 8 points, on the same ballot where Joe Biden carried Maine by roughly 9 points. She remains the only Republican to win a Senate race in a state carried by the Democratic presidential nominee since 2004. Now, as the only Republican held seat up in a state that voted for Kamala Harris in 2024, and given Collins' history of overperformance despite Maine's Democratic lean, this is widely considered Democrats' best pickup opportunity in 2026. The prediction market, Kalshi, currently gives Democrats a slight edge, with a 52% chance of unseating Collins, effectively making this a toss-up. Democrats' strongest potential candidate is likely Congressman Jared Golden, who has consistently won re-election in Maine's more conservative, rural 2nd District, a district Donald Trump has carried in 3 consecutive presidential elections. However, Golden is more likely to run for the state's open governor's seat. This is one of those races where candidates will make all the difference. If Golden enters and wins the Democratic nomination, I'd lean toward rating this tilt to lean Democratic, but for now it remains a toss-up, joining North Carolina and Georgia. So that brings us to a 51 to 46 seat split in favor of Republicans, with the 3 toss-ups ultimately determining which party comes out of the 2026 cycle feeling good about its electoral prospects moving forward. At this point, I'd estimate Republicans have at least an 80 to 90% chance of holding the chamber. Yet for Democrats, winning these 3 toss-ups would be a big step toward a potential comeback come 2028. As always, feel free to share your thoughts on this map in the comments and suggest any other videos or topics you'd like me to cover. That's it for today's video. Shout out to my channel members listed in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed the content. Check out more of my videos here, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. EP out.